Welcome to session 103 of Worlds of Speculative Fiction. So the novels that we're looking at this time, the series, is kind of a short one. It's two novels by Mary Doria Russell, and it's typically called the Sparrow series after the first installation in it, the Sparrow. And the second one is Children of God. It could equally be called the Children of God series, given the thematics and the characters and the plot as we're going to go into it. And these are from the late 1990s, 1996, 1998. They are set in a universe very much like our own, but with the addition of several sentient alien species on a planet that's not that far away from our own solar system. And we'll get into all of that with discussions about the world building in a bit. This was a reader or fan selection. If you've been following this series, Worlds of Speculative Fiction, which we've been doing now for over 10 years, you know that every year towards the end, I ask people who are fans of the series, who would you like me to do next? And we do a vote. And this series won the vote for inclusion in this year's Worlds of Speculative Fiction. I have greatly enjoyed these, so whoever it was that recommended them, you've been vindicated. Unfortunately, I can't thank you personally, but just, if you're hearing this or watching this, you've got my gratitude. Now, if you're new to this series, Worlds of Speculative Fiction is a monthly talk series that has been going on since 2016. Originally, it was in person here in the greater Milwaukee area. When COVID hit, we went online, and we've been doing it in this format ever since because it allows more people to easily participate. What I do is create a video like this, anywhere from 90 to 120 minutes, and as the video premieres for the first time, I'm there engaging in live chat with anybody who's watching it and participating. So it's a great opportunity to get to talk about these volumes as we're running the video. And then afterwards, we meet for a Zoom video conferencing session, which is always kind of fun, and talk about it a bit more. Of course, you can always participate after the fact by writing comments in the video, and sometimes maybe we'll revisit this. So why is it Worlds of Speculative Fiction? So it is speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, horror, alternate history, magical realism, all sorts of other interpenetrating genres, the new weird, for example. And so we're confining ourselves to that. And it's worlds because we look at world building across multiple stories. So, we like things like this, where there's a series of novels or short stories or other types of literature as well. But the author has put together some sort of narrative universe in which the plots take place and the characters are developed and do their things and the various themes are worked out. Since I am a philosopher by training and trade, I also focus quite a lot on philosophical themes that are important in the stories. And with these, we're going to be talking about the nature of language, because that's a major part of it. We're going to talk a good bit about ethics and society. We're also going to be talking about some other issues. If, for example, Children of God, we'll talk about some philosophy of religion as well. So there's a lot of important, interesting themes woven into these sorts of literature. And speculative fiction is, of course, speculative. So when it's done well, it's always going to intersect importantly with philosophy. Since this is the first one that we have devoted to Mary Doria Russell, I'll be talking a bit about her biography, so we get to know her. We'll also look at some of the things that she has had to say about her own work. It's nice when we have that, but we'll be focusing a lot on looking at the world building and some of these really key philosophical themes. We won't get to every single thing, even if we devote 2 hours to it, but we can get into a lot. So I hope that you're ready for delving into these. If you haven't read the books, you'll get to learn a lot more about them. There will be spoilers, so I just want to put that up front. But with great literature, even if there are spoilers, that doesn't keep you from enjoying the narrative as you come across it, any more than it would, hurt you to find out that in the Iliad, Achilles dies, right? You can still appreciate the Iliad for its great dramatic artistry and the wonderful themes that are built into it. So that's enough out of me. Session 103 officially begins now. I think that before we go into any of the other matters substantively that we're going to discuss shortly, the world building, the biography of Mary Doria Russell, philosophical themes, the things that she has to say about her own works, it might be very helpful to give you kind of a thumbnail sketch of what's going on in these two particular books, and to tell you a little bit about how they're structured, not so much plot-wise, but in the way that the plot is actually revealed, particularly in the first work. So these are, to put it very, very broadly, novels of exploration, encounter, and engagement between different species. It's happening in our future, extrapolating from the Earth that we know, or rather knew in the 1990s onward. And the very first chapter of the Sparrow, because each of the chapters are numbered with dates, is December 2059, but we could say that the story is actually beginning in February 2019, which is already our past, but, was the future of the time of the writing of these books. And I'm going to talk about how the stories are winding up together. It's also going to be ending with the very last chapter of Children of God in 2096. So we're talking about a space of roughly 80 years or so in narrative time, and there are characters holding it together. So what ends up happening is Earth starts receiving some radio signals, and it turns out that they're actually music. So this is a very exciting development. We've been looking for extraterrestrial life for a very long time. We've also been broadcasting lots of stuff of our own into space. Maybe that's not the smartest idea, but that's a topic for other novels. For example, Lucy Shin's, novels with the dark forest, conjecture and all of that sort of stuff. Anyway, putting that aside, this gets people very interested in perhaps going out there and finding out what other intelligent life is there. And that does indeed happen under the auspices of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, right? So there's a mission. And it's kind of in some ways, parallel, or I won't say replication, but a reinterpretation in action of previous Jesuit missions. And the Jesuits, we can talk about this a little bit more later, were pretty good at doing that sort of thing historically. So they're going to go to this planet called Rakat. And on that planet, they are going to discover ultimately two different intelligent sentient species. There's many other types of animals and plants as well, but there are two in particular. One is the vast majority. Those are the ones they encounter first, the Runa. And then there's a much smaller in population, but much greater in terms of determining the society, holding status, at least at the time, the Janata. And they're going to meet quite a few people of different sorts within these different groups that are connected together. You could say symbiotically, you could say exploitatively. That's also a really important discussion. Now, you notice that I said the very first chapter of the Sparrow is beginning in 2059 and the second in 2019, 40 years later. Why is that the case? Well, the story is being told, at least in the Sparrow, in, you could say, two different sequences. One is beginning in the time after Emilio Sandoz has come back, after the second of the journeys of Terrans to this other planet, Rakata, which is not that far, has taken place. They bring him back. He is in terrible shape. A lot of the story is his recovery from having been modified in his hands, having been raped over and over and over again, all the stuff that has happened, the terrible opprobrium foisted upon him by journalists, by governments, by even people within the church, and him sort of coming to terms with what has happened. That's one story moving forward. We are also getting the story of how the first journey even began, some of the other important characters involved in it, and starting with Jimmy Quinn, the ultimate flight there, the landing, all the things that are taking place. And we're converging with these stories on what actually has taken place. So in the present, the narrative present, there's a lot of retrospective going back, and eventually the stories are going to converge by the end of that book. Children of God is not set up quite like that. Instead, it's more linear in its development. It's beginning in, here we go, 2060 and running through that time, and ultimately, winding up by the chapters towards the end in 2078 is using Earth stuff. And then eventually we're going to get a coda, which is sort of a, many years later, sum up in 2096. So there's a lot of, you could say, jumping around. Well, why is that the case? Time dilation is a part of this. They are traveling at not close to light speeds, but getting faster than anything has ever gone before. And so time is passing quicker on Earth and actually on the other planet as well than it is for those who are in transit. And their ages are getting kind of messed with as well. So some of the characters are close to each other in age at certain points, and then because one is staying on the planet and the other is in transit, they're aging at different times. So there's a lot of very interesting, you could say, matters like that are getting explored, and they're part of the very structure of these novels. So I think that's enough to maybe whet your appetite. I already mentioned one of the important spoilers that's being dealt with in The Sparrow. Emilio Sandoz's horrible humiliation, rape, and the effects on his faith because of that, that he's able to eventually come to terms with, although not in terms of his relation to God, who he was very devoted to before. So I think that is enough to say at this point, And now we can start moving into some of the other bigger, longer discussion matters. I'm going to keep the biography of Mary Doria Russell relatively brief here so that we have enough time to talk about philosophical themes, world building, and some other related matters. So she is still a living author, although at this point in retirement, occasionally giving addresses and contributing to her community. She and her husband are located in the Ohio, near Cleveland area at this point in time. And she also began her life in the Midwest as well. In 1950, she was born in Elmhurst, which is a Chicago suburb, and her parents were both military people, a Navy nurse and a Marine drill sergeant, and it looks like her dad went into law enforcement after that. And she went through, sort of normal schooling, elementary school, middle school, high school. In high school, she would meet her husband-to-be. As a matter of fact, in one interview, she talks about, how awkward and not particularly with it or attractive they were. When you see somebody at their lowest, you can only sort of go upward, but they, essentially fell in love. And by the time that she's 20 in 1970, they are getting married to each other. And she will, already by that time, have gone to the University of Illinois. And the career path that she chose was not that of writing. It was actually anthropology. And I'm going to say a little bit here, just in case people don't know this, about anthropology as a discipline. So you think of what we call the social sciences, psychology, economics, sociology, anthropology, geography is also within there, as well as some others. And you see the ology and you think they all kind of work the same. Anthropology has always been a very diverse discipline with a number of different subfields that sometimes are not communicating as effectively with each other as they could. Mary Doria Russell is actually studying many different aspects of anthropology, but to study anthropology also means studying a great number of other things as well. Some of them very hard scientific, some of them in the humanities, for example, learning languages and studying how languages actually work, which plays a big role, given that Emilio Sandez is a linguist par excellence, right, in the Sparrow and Children of God. And so there's a lot of, you could say, stuff packed into an anthropology degree. So she goes to University of Illinois, which is down in Champaign, not far from the Chicagoland area, and studies cultural anthropology, graduates in 1972, goes to Northeastern in Boston, and there she's going to study social anthropology, graduating in 1976. And then in 1983, she's going to be at the University of Michigan and completes her PhD in biological anthropology. So she's hitting a lot of the important areas of it. After that, she says, well, there's not a lot of jobs out there, so she applies for and wins and takes a 3-year fellowship in, interestingly, bone biology at Case Western Reserve, but it's not in the anthropology department. It's in the School of Dentistry. That's in Ohio, in Cleveland. So they're moving around. And her husband is a software engineer, a rather portable job to have. She is actually going to do a good bit of work from 1986 to 1992, doing work primarily writing manuals for MRI scanners, but also publishing within the field of anthropology. and doing a number of consulting jobs. Her husband is going to later found a company that makes medical imaging equipment. So, their careers are kind of linked together. They will adopt a son, Daniel, born in Croatia in 1985. And by the 1990s, she is deciding to do something different. And she is going to work on and write this first novel. Now, it's incorporating a lot of her, you could say, both educational background and studies, and also, some of her observations and experience working in a number of different connected fields. And The Sparrow is published in 1996. It is going to win a whole bunch of awards over time. The Otherwise / James Tripty Jr. Award, the Arthur C. Clarke Award, which is pretty cool to get, the British Science Fiction Association Best New Novel, John W. Campbell Best New Writer, and then Children of God is going to come out not long after that, 1998. And together they're actually going to win the Galactic Spectrum Hall of Fame Award together. She doesn't continue that particular series, in part because she doesn't need to if you've read the series, and she's going to write a number of other novels. A Thread of Grace in 2005, Dreamers of the Day in 2008, Doc, 2011, Epitaph, a novel of the OK Corral in 2015, and the latest one, The Women of Copper County in 2019. And so that brings us largely up to date. Again, she remains active within a number of communities. You can actually find online how she and her husband both are involved in benefiting their own local community. And, that's kind of a nice place to close this short biography of the writer of these two excellent novels, among many other novels. Given that this is Worlds of Speculative Fiction, you can well imagine that world building is going to be an important part of this, and we really do get some premier concentrated world building on the part of Russell in these two novels. And a lot of it is going to be located on Rakat, the planet. I will talk a little bit here and there about Earth, but it's an Earth of the future. That's really the most you need to know, I think, as far as this part goes. What we're really interested in is the planet that they encounter, where there are two sentient species that are closely connected with each other. At first in a system that's been around for a very long time, and then later, as we're going to see, in conflict. So I want to begin actually a good ways into the Sparrow, where the first mission, the first Earth mission, the Jesuit mission, is arriving near the planet. And Jimmy says, we found it. We found a planet. Might not be the singer's planet, but we found a planet. Now, who are the singers? The singers are the ones who had the music that led them to seek out the planet, the system to begin with. They receive these transmissions, and they're like, well, it's got to be intelligent life. So they are not quite there yet. The Stella Maris is passing out of the plane of the Alpha Centauri system, and they lose the radio signals altogether. And they're thinking about, what are they going to do? They're inspecting it. They look around. They see moons available, and they see there's our planet. A good-sized moon keeps the planet's precision steady enough for stable weather patterns to develop. If there's open water, moons make tides, and tides breathe life. Because that, and then Anne looked at him, and the naturalist smiled, because that's the way God likes it, Madame, right? And so they're figuring out how to get to that planet. Then eventually they do. They make landfall, and they're going to encounter their first group of villagers, the Runa. And so there's there's the first contact, definitely not conflict. So I'm going to read you this. There was no panic in either group. The villagers stopped a few hundred paces down the path from Emilio and unburdened themselves of the big well-made baskets, which were filled with something that was not heavy, judging from the ease with which the containers were handled, even by the smaller individuals. They were unclothed, but around their limbs and necks many wore bright ribbons which fluttered and floated sinuously in the wind. The breeze shifted more decisively, and suddenly D.W. was aware of an exquisite scent, floral, he thought, coming from the crowd. He focused on the open-work basketry and realized the containers were filled with white blossoms. For a short while, the two groups simply stood and looked at one another, the piping voices of juveniles hushed by adults, murmurs, and commentary falling off to silence. As D.W. took in the command structure of the group, so Anne Edwards studied the anatomy. The two species were not grotesque to one another. They shared a general body plan, bipedal with forelimbs, specialized for grasping and manipulation. Their faces also held a similarity in general, and the differences were not shocking or hideous to Anne. She found them beautiful, as she found many other species beautiful, here and at home. Large mobile ears, erect and carried high on the sides of the head, gorgeous eyes, large and densely lashed, calm as camels. The nose was convex, broad at the tip, curving smoothly off to feed the muzzle, which projected rather more noticeably than was the case among humans. The mouth lipless and broad. There were many differences, of course. On the gross level, the most striking was that the humans were tailless, an anomaly on their home planet as well. The vast majority of vertebrates on Earth had tails, and Anne had never understood why apes and guinea pigs had lost them. Another human oddity stood out, relative hairlessness. The villagers were covered with smooth, dense coats of hair lying flat to muscular bodies. They were sleek as Siamese cats, buff-colored with lovely brown markings around the eyes like Cleopatra's Kohl. So we've got a physical description of the Runa. And they have a language. Emilio Sandes is there to learn their language. He is an incredibly talented linguist. And this is now him being asked about it many, many years later. And so here we go. He says, the ability to speak a language perfectly does not necessarily confer any linguistic understanding of it. My advanced training is in anthropological linguistics, so my purpose in working with Asimov was not merely to be able to ask someone to pass the salt, but to gain insight into a people's underlying cultural assumptions and cognitive makeup. An example. One day, Asimov showed me a very pretty glass flask and used the word ayahuasca. My first guess was that the word was more or less equivalent to jar, container, or bottle, but one can never be certain, so one tests. I pointed to the sides of the flask and asked if this was ayahuasca. No, that had no name. I pointed to the rim, and again, that was not ayahuasca and had no name. So I pointed to the bottom and asked again, wrong again. And Asimov became annoyed because I kept asking stupid questions. I was also irritated, yes. I didn't know if she was teasing me or if I was confused, and perhaps it was the shape of the flask or its style or even the price of the flask. Turns out that ayahuasca refers to the space enclosed. The capacity for containment was the important element, not the physical object. Similarly, there's a word for the space we would call a room, but no word for wall or ceiling or floor as such. It's the function of the object that's named. You can refer to the ceiling by noting that the rain is prevented from taking place in this space because of it. They have no concept of borders, such as separate our nations. They speak in terms of what a geographic region contains, a flower for making this distillation, or an herb that is good for that dye. Eventually, I came to understand the Runa do not have vocabulary for the edges we perceive separating one element from another. This reflects their social structure and their perceptions of the physical world, and even their political status. And we're going to find out that with both the Runa and the Janata, that the languages that they speak take a lot of work to understand, not simply linguistically, but in terms of their cultures. And this is going to lead to problems later on that we'll talk about. Now, I do want to actually jump ahead. So we've mentioned that there are two different species existing there. And part of what we get from them is, you could call it a kind of mythology. And I've got two passages in particular, one in one book, one in the other, that are brought up. So I'm going to do this a bit out of order. So the Vacanci are host to the foreign delegation, and Supari is a Janata third who is working with them, and we get these storytellers telling us things. The storytellers claim that the first 5 Janata hunters and the first 5 Runa herds were created by Ingui on an island where balance could be easily lost and annihilation was the price of poor stewardship. 5 times the hunters and their mates erred, leaving things to chance, killing without thought, letting their own numbers grow uncontrolled, and all was lost. Because, so you see, the Janata prey on the Runa. On the 6th attempt, Tikat, father of us all, learned to breed the Runa, and Sahari, our mother, was made his consort, and they were brought to the mainland and given dominion. There were other stories about Pau and Tihai and the first brothers, and on and on. Who knew? Maybe there was some truth in it all, but Supari was a skeptic. The Ingui cycle was too pat an explanation for duogeniture, which is a very important part of Janata culture, as we'll talk about. Too convenient for firsts and seconds, justifying their grip on the world. It didn't matter. Whether the legends grew from ancient seeds of truth or sprang fully formed from the self-interest of the rulers, Supari thought things are as they are. Right? Now, we get another bit of the mythology later on in Children of God. So this is a Runao, talking to another one of the important characters who is going to become a major figure in changing the culture of the Janata. And this is Hlavin. And so she says, here we go. The oldest songs explain it, sir. Ingui, who loves order, spoke to the first brothers, Chorhil and Sirmat, when women gather, chaos dances. Therefore, separate Pao and Tihai, the fierce sisters you've married, and keep them apart and captive. With trickery and cunning, Chorhil and Sirmat conspired with other men until they had all subdued their wives and daughters. But when they themselves did the culling and the butchering, the men too became blood-drunk and fought. We cannot wall ourselves up, they said. So Ingui commanded, let those who are wise decide who among you is too fierce to live, and let those who are strong kill the fierce ones condemned by the wise. And because Churil the elder was strong, and Srimat the younger was wise, from that time on, the firstborn males of each sept were charged with combat and ritual killing, the secondborn with adjudication and decision. So this is also explaining the basis of their society. And do you believe that? Hlavin asked her bluntly. Her eyes opened. It all happened long before the Runa were domesticated, Selikat replied, dropping her tail with a soft and possibly ironic thud. In any case, what importance is the belief of an insignificant tutor, my lord? You are not insignificant. You are tutor to the Cathari Reshtar. Tell me what you think, the child ordered, imperious even then. Selikat drew herself up, a person of some dignity. Stability and order have always been paid for with captivity and blood, the Runao told her charge. The songs also tell of the age of constancy, when everything was as it should be and each man knew his place and his families. There was respect for those above and courtesy from those below. All elements were in balance, stewardship triumphant and chaos contained. Yes, yes. Ferocity controlled like a woman in her chamber, or a Reshtar in exile, the boy said. She'd beaten him regularly, but he was still impulsive and perilously cynical. Were things ever Truly so neat, Seleucus? Even when men keep their place, the ground can split, swallowing towns. What of balance then? Floods can drown half the population of a low-lying province. A city can lie under ash in less time than it takes to sleep off a meal. True, Seleucus conceded. And worse, there are those who secretly nurture disputes, unleashing vendettas whenever circumstance favors them. Jealousy exists and self-seeking competition for its own sake, and aggression and anger, the blind, deaf rage to settle something once and for all. The Runau stopped deferential, but the beneficiary of generations of selective breeding and the absolute mistress of her field of knowledge. All her life, she had lived among people endowed with a predator species anatomy, reflexes, instincts, the grasping feet, the slicing claws, the powerful limbs, the patience to stalk, the cleverness to ambush, the quickness to kill. Seleucus had seen what is done to freethinkers, and she did not wish that fate for Hlaven. In opposition to all that ferocity, she resumed, there have been great jurists, resourceful diplomats, men whose voices can restore calm and bring others to their senses. You, my lord, are named for the greatest of these, Hlaven Ra, whose wisdom is enshrined in the fundamental law of Inkrobar, whose oratorial "Shall we be as women" is sung by every breeding male when he comes of age and takes his place in society. And what if Hlaven Ra had been born third? His namesake asked, or even first. Seleucus was silent for a time. Then she beat him. What if was more dangerous than why? So what we have is a society in which there are norms that are in place. And it's one where there are many, many, many runa and a much, much smaller population of the predator species, the cicada, right? The ones who are culling them, who have bred them, and will, in the end, lose hold of that power. So coming back to Hlaven, right? We contrast him with the Supari. The two men had this in common. They'd been born in the same season 30 years earlier. As thirds, they existed in a state of statutory sterility. Neither was allowed to marry or have children legally. Both of them had made more of their lives than anyone could expect it, given their birth positions. Yet, since their honor derived not from inheritance but accomplishment, they both existed largely outside the bounds of their society. Now, what's going to end up happening is that Supari is going to be connected with the humans and the Runa, and he's going to give Sandoz to Hlaven Cathari as a gift, and that allows him to assume a place. He'll actually have a child who will be born malformed. He will rescue her, name her after Hana, and become a rebel. Whereas Hlaven Cathari is going to frame Supari as he kills his own clan and is able to take the spot of the first and assume power and changes his society radically over time. Another thing that's very interesting about the Runa, this is being talked about later in conference, Sandoz says, Dr. Edwards believed the concept of heart and the Runa theory of illness were closely related. Both served as rather benign means of social control. The Runa are not openly aggressive and claim to never become angry. If, for example, someone was refused a legitimate request or was thwarted or disappointed in some way, the aggrieved person would fall into a state of porai. When you are porai, your heart is sad and you may grow ill or become prone to accidents. Making someone sad is bad form. If you make someone else porai, you feel considerable social pressure to give in to the request or provide compensation to the supposed victim. Apologize or give some gift that restores the victim's heart to happiness. Then Volker says, there would be a good deal of room for misuse of a concept like that. What prevents people from claiming they're pariah simply to get presents? The Runa are almost never alone. Hardly any social interaction is without witnesses, so it's hard for someone simply to lie about an occurrence. However, there was often disagreement about the seriousness of the victim's state of pariah and the amount or kind of compensation due. If the argument got loud, the participants were told they were making a fierno, a big noise. Yes, if you make a fierno, it supposedly attracts thunderstorms, which can be violent and frightening. And he says, what if there's a storm when no one's been arguing? Emilio shrugged and made a face that said, that's obvious, surely. Someone in a nearby village has made a fierno. So that's part of the culture there as well. And here we get a very interesting explanation, a kind of info dump here. So here we go. Emilio, you may recall that Supari Vajnur reportedly told Wu and Isley there'd never been trouble between the Janata and the Runa before our mission arrived. And here's what Emilio says. Supari may have been pleased to think so. The Runa do not write histories. I speak only from analogy, gentlemen. There were no Taino or Arawak or Carib historians, but there was certainly conflict in the Caribbean, both before and after the arrival of Columbus. Volker broke the silence that fell after that, returning to his earlier theme. Surely it's unusual for two species to resemble each other so closely. Are they related biologically as well as culturally? Dr. Edwards was able to obtain blood samples for genetic analysis. The two species were almost certainly not related except distantly, as mammals like lions and zebra are related. So Father Robichaud and Dr. Edwards thought the similarities might be due to convergence, a natural selection and the evolution of sentience that led the two species to similar morphology and behavioral traits. I think not. You understand that I speculate, and this is not my field. The Janata are carnivores with a detention, teeth, and forelimb adapted for killing. Their intelligence and capacity for complex social organization probably evolved in the context of cooperative hunting. The Runa are vegetarians with a broad range of diet. Their fine motor control likely derived from manipulative skill associated with the exploitation of small seeds, picking blossoms, and so forth. Their three-dimensional memories are excellent. They carry very precise mental maps of their environment and the changing array of seasonal resources. This may account for the evolution of their intelligence, but only in part. The paleontology of our own planet has many examples of predators and prey locked in competition, ratcheting upward in intelligence and sophisticated adaptation. A biological arms race, one might say. On Rakat, in my opinion, this competition resulted in the evolution of two sentient species. Are you saying that the Runa were the prey? John asked, horrified. Sandoz turned. Of course. I believe that the Janata morphology is a form of mimicry, selected for during predation on Runa herds. Even now, Runa prefer to travel in large groups with the smaller males and young in the center of the troop and the larger adult females on the outside. 100, 200,000 years ago, the resemblance between the two species was not nearly so striking. But Janata, who could best blend in with the female Runa at the edges of the herd, were the most successful hunters. But they cooperate now, Felipe said. The Janata rule, but they trade with the Runa. They work together. Oh yes, Sandoz agreed. The relationship would certainly have evolved since those days, as would the species themselves. All that is speculation. Gentlemen, the Runa fulfill many roles in Janata culture. They're skilled in crafts, they're traders, servants, laborers, bookkeepers, even research assistants, even concubines. It is a form of birth control. Supari Vagager explained this to me. As stewards of the world, Janata impose strict population controls. Janata couples may have more than 2 children, but only the first 2 may marry and establish families. The rest must remain childless. If latter-born individuals do breed, they're neutered by law, as are their offspring. Janata have proven sterility, often neutered thirds, sometimes serve as prostitutes, but cross-species intercourse is by definition sterile. Sex with Runa partners carries no risk of pregnancy or even disease. For this reason, Runa concubines are commonly used as sexual partners by individuals whose families are complete or not permitted to breed. Felipe, shocked, asked, "Do the Runa consent to this?" It was Mephistopheles who laughed. Consent is not an issue. The concubines are bred to it. The Runa are not unintelligent, and some are marvelously talented, but they are essentially domesticated animals. The Janata breed them as we breed dogs. And what ends up happening in the Sparrow is, because of the humans being there and starting gardens, the Runa make gardens, and they start having more food available. They start having more children, and that dangerous, threat of changing the social environment brings down a Janata attack on them, killing them. And Sophia actually is going to, inspire them to fight back. And we find out much more about that in Children of God, where Sandoz has thought that Sophia was actually dead. So we start with Sophia, who is, witnessing all of these things. The culls went on across southern Inbrocar, anywhere the gardens had been planted. Runa fathers in little groups of 2 and 3 continued to arrive with infants, bringing news as well. Once women from Kashan visited, aware now that Djalo Vashkan had saved her life and the lives of many other. Sophia took the girl aside to thank her during a brief lull. And she says, Djalo, why must the Runa go back to the villages at all? Why not simply walk away from the Janata? Why not show your tales to them and live here? Djalo looked around the forest settlement, and it was only then her ears dropped. Distressed by the sight of Runa living like animals, she told Sophia, our homes are back there. We can't leave the villages and cities. That's where we live and trade. And then she says, Sipaj, Fia, we made the cities. To come here for a time is acceptable. To walk away from the art of our hands and the places of our hearts is not. Even so, you could stop cooperating with the Janata, said Sophia. Startled by the idea, Djalo huffed at her, but Sophia did not give up. Are they children, that you should carry them? The Janata have no right to breed you, no right to say who has babies, who lives and who dies. They have no right to slaughter you and eat your bodies. Kanchai says that it's the law, but it's only the law because you agree to it. Change the law. Seeing the doubt, the slight anxious swaying from side to side, Sophia whispered, Djalo, you don't need the Janata. They need you. The girl sat balanced and upright. But what would the Janata eat? She asked, ears cocked forward. Who cares? Let them eat piat. Rakat is covered with animals that can be eaten by carnivores. You are more than meat. You have the right to stand up and say never again. They have claws and customs on their side. You have numbers and justice, she'd meant to say. But there was no word in Ruanja for justice or for fairness or equity. You have the strength if you choose to use it. And we find that that's what actually does end up happening. We get some interesting discussion of the child who is born slightly crippled, and Supari is thinking about this and realizes that he's been used, and he takes her, and they come to that place out there in the forest. Now I'm going to skip far ahead, because what's going to end up happening is Sophia is successful, and the Runa revolt, and there are so many more of them than there are the Janata. So here we go. All over Rakat's largest continent, inarticulate resentment had been given voice by Supari Vagajur, so one of the Janata, and Djalo Vakashan and their followers. The ordinary weapons of the powerless, the specious compliance and counterfeit ignorance, the pilfering and petty obstructions, the foot-dragging and pretense of vacuous misunderstanding, all these were laid aside in favor of an astonishing and exhilarating strength. Like sleepers awakening from a dream of impotence, the Runa awoke to their own power and unleashed a force whose potential was previously understood only by the Janata, who had rightly feared it. After the first convulsion of revolt, after Geiger and Agardi were liberated, fear and suspicion did a lot of the work for them. A Janata patriarch would wake in the morning to find his household deserted by its Runa staff and a knife lying on the sleeping nest next to his throat. If he had any sense at all, he'd take his family and flee north. Oh, there was resistance. There were forays and challenges even in the beginning. But knowledge is power. And with Sofia Mendez's help, the Runa had become very knowledgeable indeed. She had provided schematics of advanced communications and data processing equipment. And more important, Sofia provided the awareness such things could be manufactured. Given the seed of an idea, the Runa were capable of elaborating on it quickly and creatively. Radio equipment had once served Janata governments. Now it was modified to make use of the orbiting satellites put in place by the crew of the Stella Maris, allowing the entire army to communicate instantly. After a time, all young officers learned English, as unbreakable a code as Navajo had been in Earth's global war. So what we see is the Janata are slowly being wiped out, and many of them become refugees. Hanala, the Janata child of Supari, Isaac, Sophia's son, and a number of others flee to the north because they are going to create a new sort of society up there where Runa and Janata and human can live together. But they're starving, they're essentially refugees and having quite a bit of difficulty there. So we learn that there's a bitterness and hatred that arises. This is much later in 2080. Yoseba is finding out what was going on from local Runa, and finds out that the government was wiping out villages that gave shelter to the city Runata. Before long, they were burning our natural rockar fields in the Midlands to starve us into submission. What tipped the balance was when Fia, that's Sophia, believed they began to use biologicals against us. When she was a child, Fia had seen diseases used against a people called the Kurds. When the plagues began, we thought Runa behind Jana lines were made ill and smuggled south and left to infect those who came in contact with them. And the Janata appeared to leave us no alternative but to strike back with overwhelming force. Thousands and thousands died of plague. We were fighting for our lives, so were they, I suppose. Sipaj Puska, somebody wonders if the Janata themselves changed or the Runa idea of the Janata changed. She says, my idea of the Janata changed when I left Trukasai. When I first went to Morel, the things we saw, I keened every night for a season. There were roads paved with our bones, crushed and mixed with limestone, levees along the rivers 3 times the height of a woman, all bone, boots from the skins of our dead. Even Runa wore them in the cities. Platters of tongues, platters of hearts, legs, shoulders, feet, fillets and chops, rump and tail, elbows and knees, all beautifully displayed. Runa domestics would come and pick out the cut of meat to serve to their masters. How could they stand it? How could the Janata have asked it of them? So, later we're going to get Emilio talking with Sophia, saying, Sophia, you've actually got it wrong. And she says, you've come back after 40 years and taken 3 weeks to get to know the situation. Now you propose to explain Rakat to me. And he says, no, not Rakat. Just one small settlement of Janata trying not to starve to death. That's all that's left. They're below the maintaining a species population level at this point. And he says, Sophia, do you realize the Janata are nearly extinct? Surely you didn't mean. Is that what they told you, she asked, and you believe them? Damn it, Sophia, don't patronize me. I know starvation when I see it. What if they are starving, she snapped. Shall I regret a cannibal starves? Oh, for Christ's sake, Sophia, they aren't cannibals. And what would you call it? They eat Runa. Sophia, listen to me. No, you listen to me, Sandoz. For nearly 30 years, we, but not you, fought an enemy whose whole civilization was the purest expression of the most characteristic form of evil, the willingness to erase the humanity of others and turn them into commodities. In life, the Runa were conveniences for the Janata, slaves, assistants, sex toys, and death raw materials, meats, hides, bones, labor first, livestock in the end. But the Runa are more than meat, Sandoz. They're a people who have earned their liberty and won it from those who kept them in bondage, generation after generation. God wanted their freedom. I helped them to get it, and I regret nothing. We gave the Janata justice. They reaped precisely what they sowed. So God wants them extinct? Emilio cried. He wants the Runa to turn the planet into a grocery store. God wants a place where no one sings, where everyone is alike, where there's one kind of person. Sophia, this has gone way past an eye for an eye. The sound was like a gunshot, flat and unresonant, and he could feel the exact outline of her hand stinging in sharp form on his face. He says, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened here. I won't pretend to understand what you lived through. But I do know what it is to be a commodity. I know what it is to be erased. I know what it is to be falsely accused. And God help me, I know what it is to be guilty. Sophia, I have eaten Runa, and for the same reason the Janata did, because I was hungry and wanted to live. And I have killed. I killed Oxma. Sophia, I didn't mean it to be her, but I wanted to kill. I wanted someone to die so I could be free one way or the other. I'm the last person to judge you, and I grant you that the Janata you fought got what was coming to them. But Sophia, you can't let the Runa kill them all. They've paid for their sins. And then, we see that in the end, mercy is shown, and a new sort of configuration is going to be arrived at. And it's in part because of the message from Isaac and from Hanala, who dies and says to send her children to her mother, who is the human, Sophia. Long after her father, the Janata, Supari, has been killed. And so we arrive at a new sort of configuration for the planet. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but there is at least the possibility of hope and an ending of genocide and exploitation taking place there. And that's essentially how the story is wrapping up for us, except for the epilogue, which we'll talk about in terms of music. If you're somebody who's been following this series, Worlds of Speculative Fiction, you know that when we have an author who has actually told us about their works in interviews or essays, we like to bring those up because it's valuable testimony about what they are up to, and it helps to inform our discussion of the philosophical themes. And this one is full of very interesting philosophical themes, some of which we've already been discussing. So there are a number of interviews that Mary Doria Russell has granted over the years talking about these two works in particular, as well as some other related matters, and I'd like to share some of those interviews, snippets from them, with you as we think through these novels together. So I'm going to begin with looking at the issue of genre and science fiction in particular. In the Book Slut interview, she's asked, do you see your books as belonging to any genre at all? And interestingly, Russell is going to say, not really. Genre is a tool. I don't sit down and think I should write a mystery. Now, who gets murdered? Instead, I get interested in something like the 1921 Cairo Peace Conference, and as I read, I'm thinking, should I attempt to write this in first person as T.E. Lawrence? Nah, but maybe a first-person narrative. Wait, here's a missionary lady from Ohio who taught Lawrence to speak Arabic. Well, I'll be damned. Now that's interesting, except I've already done so much religious stuff. What if it were her sister who is the narrator? She could be a teacher. All that's going on while I'm still farting around reading biographies and histories and political analyses of the Middle East. So that's how I decide on things. Christian Century asked her, how would you describe the progression of your fiction? And she says, absolutely unanticipated. I'm not one of those people who always wanted to be a writer. I was always a passionate reader, but I never imagined I would ever write fiction of any sort, unless you count grant proposals. That's a nice academic inside joke there, right? You're always making promissory notes. When I finished The Sparrow, it felt like a miracle, something utterly outside my natural world and wholly astonishing even to me. I figured, okay, that was one of a kind. It'll never happen again. After writing 4.3 novels, I'm better at this job now, or more efficient anyway. I know how to organize the research, and I've got a good feel for how long a chapter ought to be, and how to balance narrative, dialogue, character, and plot. The Sparrow remains special, but each one of the books has drawn me in, pulled me along, seduced me, and dominated my life for years at a time. The Sparrow and its sequel, Children of God, are about religion and faith. I said all I had to say about those topics, and to date, I haven't felt the need to go back over that ground. Coming back to the Book Slut interview, she's asked, your first two books can be classified as science fiction, but your new book is rooted in history rather than science. Some readers may see your new book as a departure from your earlier works, but is it? In all your books, you're looking at the world through the prism of another time. And so Russell says, yeah, exactly. As I wrote The Sparrow, I thought of it as a historical novel that takes place in the future. I wanted an omniscient narrator to have a kind of looking back on it all now perspective. The tone for that was set in the last line of The Sparrow. They meant no harm. Each of the novels required me to imagine living in a time and a place that are not my own. That's half the fun of fiction, getting out of South Euclid, Ohio, especially during the Bush II administration. With the first two books, the future had to be plausible. But what the hell, if the author tells you that Australia and Japan had teamed up to do asteroid mining, you just shrug and think, okay, if you say so, as long as it's plausible, you let it go and enjoy the ride. So there was an aspect of playfulness and creativity I could indulge in as I created Rockout, the world, and made passing reference to future events. And then finally she's asked, do you think that science fiction is particularly suited to exploring questions of religion, maybe in the same sense that legends and folktales do in other culture? And she says, well, as Stan Schmidt once said, human beings have always told stories about alien beings, but in the past they were called angels and demons and elves and trolls. Folk tales and science fiction are often about what it means to be human in a large and terrifying and beautiful universe, so naturally they overlap a great deal. And as for religion, the great monotheistic world religions address the same concern. And if God is real and the ruler of the universe, then logically that sovereignty must extend to other worlds and their inhabitants. Well, that's a perfect setup for sci-fi. In the Meta-Nexus interview, she's asked, why is science fiction an important genre? Or is it? And here's a very funny line by Russell. As one famous sci-fi writer once said, 90% of science fiction is crap. Then again, 90% of everything is crap. Certainly, the genre has allowed us to think about the unintended consequences of scientific and medical advances and so on years before history catches up with fiction. The novel 1984 now seems eerily on target, if a little premature, when you hear a president speak of unending war against shadowy enemies and the Department of Homeland Security and total information collection, and she lets it trail off. And then she's asked, what's your favorite science fiction novels and why? So this is a very interesting set of novels she's going to talk about here. Walter Miller's Canticle for Leibowitz holds up very well 3 decades after publication. I love the idea that Catholic monks would once again accept the burden of preserving knowledge in a dark age that follows a nuclear holocaust. There's something enduringly touching and hilarious about the way they treasure a grocery list scribbled by a Jewish engineer who received a phone call from his wife just before the bomb went off. Another book I love is Ursula K. Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness. Ursula was the daughter of a famous cultural anthropologist. My cat Kraber was named after him. Unlike a lot of sci-fi, Left Hand doesn't posit a whole planet with a single language and a single culture. There are political and economic and linguistic differences, conflicts, alliances. I like that complexity. I also like the unreliable narrator, Genli Ai, sent to the planet Winter as an observer and ambassador. He's an honorable man, but he misunderstands everything until it's almost too late. And since readers trust Genli, we make the same mistakes and learn our own willingness to leap to the wrong conclusions. So I think you can actually see those two novels, not copied, obviously, but they're contributing to what is going on in the Sparrow series, aren't they? If you know those novels well. Now, another key theme, we've already brought it up a little bit. Religion is big in these stories, but so is science. How do religion and science fit in with each other? So she said a lot of things about that I think are worth checking out. In Light Speed, she says, she's asked, in Children of God, in response to a question of how things were explained, one of your characters said, Hanala understood the difference between God and science, that there were different ways, parallel ways to think about the world. I love this idea and that there are parallel ways of thinking about the world. And Russell says, did I write that? It's been 13 years since I looked at that book. Anyway, it's a pretty standard observation for an anthropologist like me, or for a psychologist, I'd presume. Neither individuals nor groups have a single point of view about anything when you think about it. In my mind, 60-degree days in January in Cleveland are surprising and enjoyable, but also kind of creepy and disturbing because they're evidence of climate change in somebody else's mind. The very same weather is evidence of God's love for a bride who was praying for a nice weekend for her wedding, and also a good omen for the couple's future, which is a pagan notion. We're also seeing things, I love this phrase, kaleidoscopically, right? I suppose the most consistent theme in my work is that people see things differently, not just in parallel ways, but in conflicting ways. One person's indisputable fact is another's foolish delusion, and another's fraud, and another's half-truth, and another's ambiguity. I rarely let any character's interpretation of an event stand unchallenged. Somebody else will see things differently within a page or two. If my personality had a theme song, it would be Ain't Necessarily So. Christian Century asks her, where does your appreciation for the relationship between science and faith come from? And again, she brings up being an anthropologist. She says, I was a classically trained four-field anthropologist, which means that my studies involved archaeology, linguistics, sociocultural anthropology, and biological anthropology. I was drawn to the field because it offered a global understanding of the human species. What is the place of the human species in nature? What do people value, and how do they live their ethics? How do they combine their worldly needs for food, shelter, and a safe place to raise their children with their ideas of a life well lived? At the center of anthropology and at the center of religion are similar concerns. And I find religions and ideologies interesting because they attempt to reconcile the big and little pictures, the ways that individuals or groups behave within the context of history and culture. In science, the answer to any sensibly phrased question is theoretically knowable. The answers to the questions of faith are inherently unknowable. You cannot know the answers to the questions of faith. You can only believe you know. And then she talks about her own religious journey. One of the many reasons I feel at home within Judaism is it doesn't require or even expect faith per se. There's a large space in Judaism for doubt, for questioning, for skepticism, for agnosticism, and outright atheism. In the Torah, God tells us in essence, I don't really care if you believe in me, but obey my law. If you behave honorably and act ethically, then faith may follow, and if not, that's okay too. And then she's asked, in your novels, there's a wide spectrum of views that are entertained and given voice without this leading to agreement or resolution. What understanding of God and human nature is closest to your own? Now, notice this excellent answer here. In the Sparrow, and Children of God, all of the views of deity are mine. From Emilio Sandos's bridal mysticism to George Edwards' flat-out atheism, I get it all. I haven't experienced it all, but I get it all. Now, let's pause on that for a moment. Think of the range of attitudes of faith. Those of you who've read these novels, we don't just have, a bridal mysticism and then total betrayal by God on Sandos, the Jesuit priest's part, or, the atheism on the other hand. We have all sorts of things in between, including the perspectives of the inhabitants of both races of Rakat, the planet that they're going to, who have deities, but come to have a new religion by the midpoint and certainly at the end of Children of God. One where all three species have the same God, who wants the three species, Runa and Janata and human, to live and flourish and to coexist together. That's a possibility as well. Doubt is a possibility. And she's saying, I get all of these. That's how I can depict characters with them. In the Meta-Nexus interview, sort of following this up, she's asked, your books have atheists as well as believers. You remain agnostic. How do you feel when you get into the head of those who believe in God or don't believe it? Can you feel it? What's it like? So she says, that's a hard question to answer. Nobody else has ever asked me that. I'm sitting here really thinking about what it was like to write the scene of First Contact, when Emilio Sandés becomes the center of a crowd of aliens and natives. He, quote, feels like a prism gathering up God's love like white light and scattering it in all directions. Yes, I can conjure that feeling up as well as write about it. And the bitterness and fury that he feels later on, those are also available to me. This process of creating characters with integrity and solidity seems to me a lot like the process actors describe. You draw on your own authentic emotion, but place it in a fictional context. The emotions are the same, but what triggers them is fictional. A little bit later, she's asked, you say there's no culture with a claim to a moral high ground, yet both science and religion believe they have the moral high ground in comparison with each other. And she says, and this is kind of at significant length, when I hear arguments about which is truer, religion or science, the wrangling seems pointless to me. It's like a baseball team suddenly leaving the ball field, charging into an art gallery and yelling, you're not playing baseball! To which the only answer could be, no. Or say a bunch of art historians accuse the ball team, you're not studying art. Well, duh, they're different activities with different rules and aims. Baseball players can be interested in art history. Art historians can be baseball fans. These are simply not mutually exclusive, but they are different. When you drop a big rock, it doesn't take faith to believe it's going to be pulled towards the center of the earth, and you better move your foot out of the way. If the existence of God and the correctness of a particular theological description of God were like that, then religion would stop being about faith. Nobody can know the unknowable, which is why agnosticism seems to me to be the only defensible position logically. As an anthropologist, I would say that the idea of God allows our species to think about things that are too large, too complex, too beautiful, too horrifying to be encompassed by a single human lifespan or a single human mind. The idea of God expands human existence beyond what our senses can detect or our logic deduce. God is a remarkably powerful and enduring idea, metaphorically subsuming even sophisticated scientific formulations and adding dimension to them. A human yearning for the divine exists in all cultures, if not in all individuals. That's one of the very few statements about human beings I can't think of an exception to. What makes Homo sapiens interesting as a mammalian species is not our opposable thumbs or our rather precarious bipedal stance unassisted by a stabilizing tail, as the inhabitants of Rakat have, or our ability to make tools. What's interesting is our drive to create things like art and music and theology and poetry and theater. Consider this: when a stroke destroys the ability to speak and understand spoken language, the ability to sing and recite prayers often remains intact. We store language and rationality on the left side of the brain, music and religion on the right. In health, we aren't required to do without the one side or the other. In wholeness, we can avail ourselves of both. In the On Being interview with Krista Tippett, she's asked about converting to Judaism. She says, yeah, I converted to Judaism. Like I said earlier, I replaced Catholicism with anthropology, and ultimately that did fine for me for about 20 years until I became a mother at 35, and because I was brought up as Catholic, I was used to religions that had at least 2,000 years of road testing. And I also discovered, as I thought more clearly about why I left the church, I began to realize that for me, the incarnation was the insuperable barrier to faith. That was the point past which I could not get. So I began to realize that if I simply traced the roots of my religion back one generation, I reached the religion that Jesus practiced as opposed to the religion that deified Jesus. And a lot of the problems that I had disappeared. And the moral and ethical framework that I had really valued in Catholicism, that was all there waiting to be accessed again. Now I picked up the Holocaust, so I lost the incarnation, but I picked up the Holocaust as a major theological problem, so it wasn't a give me. And they say, there was their trade-off. Yeah, there was my trade-off. And it was in the big process of beginning to think in terms of, first I was reading on my own, and then I began studying Judaism with a rabbi and moving towards a formal conversion. And it was in that context that I began to write The Sparrow. But what I discovered as I was writing is that I'm bilingual religiously. But I am a Jew. And to bring it back to the notion of time, there is a central notion in Judaism: all of life, all of human life, is a good news, bad news story, especially in Genesis. Like good news, bad news, you have 12 sons, good news. Oh, one of them is killed by robbers. Oh, bad news. Oh, no, wait, he's still alive. Good news. No, he's been sold into slavery in Egypt. Yeah, in a lot of cases, what you find out is you don't know whether something is good or bad until generations have gone by. So then she's asked, so if I ask the question this way, what would you say you learned about the creator God of Genesis through this experience? She says, well, I learned something really both horrible and interesting. If God is an author, as devout readers of the Bible are encouraged to believe, then I know why there's evil. I've solved the problem of evil. It makes a better story. You've got no conflict if there's no evil. Then she's asked, isn't there some Talmudic saying that Eli Wiesel likes to quote, that God made man because he loves stories? And Russell says, yeah, or you could turn it around and say that people made God because they love stories too. While I was writing this, especially in the second book, Children of God, I brought my main character, Emilio Sandoz, home, and he is a damaged, angry man, a Puerto Rican Jesuit, and he believes he's the sole survivor of this Jesuit mission to another planet. And his relationship with God is what the Catholics call, he's a bridal mystic. It is an intensely personal, emotional love story for him. And then she says, what happens to him feels like a personal betrayal by God. It's like a spousal relationship. The anger a spouse feels upon discovering infidelity, and it's as though he comes to God from a very great distance. Emilio does, and he feels as though he's been led by God to love God in this personal and deeply emotional way. And when it all goes to hell, he has to face up to the question of either it has been blind, dumb luck what happened to him from start to finish, there's no meaning to it, or he has to believe, he thinks, that God is vicious. And he doesn't know what to do with that. He just doesn't know where to go with that dilemma. What do you do with an irreversible tragedy, with a catastrophe that simply cannot be undone? And Emilio tries all the ways that people try. He tries burying himself in his work. He tries forgetting. He tries drinking. He tries drugs. He tries everything. And he can't. And so he's forced to go into this need to go back to this planet and to see from the span of life that Moses had. Now, why does she talk about Moses? Because it spans 120, he's 120 years old officially, like Moses. He can see in the span of 4 generations what has happened on earth and on the planet. And so she's going to conclude this by saying, as it happens, at the very ends he finds all of this can be made sense of. There was something good that God needed these 3 species to be together in order to accomplish, that they're more together than they are apart. There's a sort of music that can only be heard if all 3 species come together. You know, is that God doing that? Is that something that we find by looking hard enough? Do we impose meaning, or is it there to be discovered? Those are the kinds of questions I find enduringly interesting. So, religion, in science, we get an interesting reflection at the start. They're often brought into conflict. They're not doing the same thing. And then we get to some pretty intense discussions about what's in religions for Russell and for her characters. Then let's talk about the tragic history and decisions and evaluations. Lightspeed Easing says at one point, you took your real-life fears and put them into fiction. And Russell says, when I started writing The Sparrow, I was thinking about the unintended but tragic consequences of simple decisions made in good faith. During these admittedly neurotic internal debates, I came to realize we never know what disaster we unknowingly averted, nor could we blame ourselves for the unintended consequences of perfectly ordinary decisions. Shit, after all, happens. There are always things that we regret or wish we'd done differently, but it's not like you get up in the morning, look in the mirror and say, I'm really going to screw things up today. I'm going to go out there and make a really massive mistake. In my observation, people always do what they think is the right thing, though not necessarily the moral thing at the time. The important part of that observation is at the time. Kierkegaard was right. Life is lived forward but understood backward. Wisdom requires the long view, and the long view is something that comes naturally to me when writing about decisions people make before they have the benefit of hindsight. In the Christian century, we widen this a bit and make it a bit more concrete. They ask, your fiction tackles the big questions like theodicy, the ways of God, and the big issues like genocide, the Holocaust, and colonialism. Why? And so she says, I seem drawn to the big picture. I crave understanding. I'm hungry to see how the large-scale and small-scale elements of human history and human lives fit together. In any consideration of the Holocaust, for example, the underlying questions are, how could this have happened? And what would I have done? The first question leads to the history of Europe, 19th century nationalism and colonialism, causes and outcomes of the Great War, the expectations of the Germans when they surrendered, their feeling of betrayal at the Paris Peace Conference, as well as religion and culture themes like millennia of religiously sanctioned violence and anti-Semitism. The second question leads me into memoirs, biographies, autobiographies, and interviews. I want to understand the way the big picture pressures came to bear on flawed, complicated, ordinary people. My novels combine those elements, the culture, the history, the personalities, and the flaws. Following up with this, not explicitly, but thematically, the Meta-Nexus interview. She's asked, you said that you started writing The Sparrow in 1992, the 500th anniversary of Columbus landing in the New World, and that history sometimes condemns the Europeans as if they set out from Spain intending to wreck the Indian culture. You said you wanted to write a story that put modern people into the same state of ignorance the early explorers experienced in the Americas. Can you talk a little bit about how using time travel and space exploration allowed you to show us deeper truths about culture and humans? So she says, from what I've seen, life is one long good news, bad news joke. What seems like bad luck at one point in our lives, infertility, for example, can turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to us. It led to adopting Dan. And what seems like a wonderful thing can turn into a nightmare. Princess Di's marriage, for example. My belief is time will tell. The story isn't over until it's over. Often events and decisions echo for centuries Even millennia. They have unintended and unimagined consequences that can show up long after everyone has forgotten about them. Whether an event is ultimately a good thing or a bad thing depends on when you decide the story has ended. To use a Christian example, the crucifixion of Jesus was bad news on Friday, but by Sunday it becomes good news. I tend to write about that metaphorical Saturday in between, when people aren't sure what's a total effing disaster and what's a necessary step on the road to a happy ending. And I always keep in mind that Monday may bring a whole new interpretation. So we also read, in your second novel, so that's Children of God, a second Jesuit mission travels to Rockot hoping to explain the tragedy of the first expedition and discover a divine purpose. Why and how is it? What is it about the human species that leads it to evil when it's trying to do good? What meaning do you see in this? What tragedy? And what hope? She says, well, in my humble opinion, you've actually got it backwards. In the Sparrow, good intentions yield catastrophe. In Children of God, there are very muddled and unethical reasons for the mission and a far less admirable crew, but the outcome isn't so bad. Irony. Distinguishing tragedy from blessing depends not only on when the judgment is made, but who is making it. Think about contact between 15th century Europeans and the native peoples of the Americas. On the broad canvas, you can see that it's a catastrophe for the Indians. But it's also the best damn thing that ever happened for a lot of European peasants, my family included. Narrow your focus a bit, and you'll find that one tribe welcomed white settlers to the Great Basin. The Shoshone were on the brink of extinction, reduced to eating mice and acorns after having been pushed out of their earlier territory by more warlike tribes. Believe it or not, we know about the mice and acorns from archaeological analyses of 150-year-old human poo. And there were Europeans who wound up in ghastly New York tenements, dying of tuberculosis, or who got off the boat and were immediately drafted into the Union Army. Not everybody got a piece of the American pie. Focus even more narrowly, you might see an Oglala Lakota whose skin cancer was cured last week in an office visit to a Bureau of Indian Affairs hospital, and a Swedish visitor who came to help with a volunteer program and was killed by a drunk driver on the same reservation. That particular Oglala might be grateful that Columbus left Spain, while the Swede might have wished he'd never heard of America. All those points of view are simultaneously valid and interesting, and I'd like to get readers to think about that. So, going more into the mechanics of things, plot and timeline, Lightspeed Easing says, because of the unique temporal realities of space travel, the events of Sparrow and Children of God occur in a fairly complex timeline. Did that ever cause difficulties in the pacing of the events of the book? Can you talk a little about what you did to keep track of when each of the characters were in relation to events and to each other? She says, well, I wrote the Sparrow in the order in which you read it, with one exception. There was one big chapter I cut in half while editing. I realized that if I separated the halves and moved the first half up, then the structure would alternate between timelines more rhythmically. Beginner's luck. Children of God was a bear to structure. I reorganized the chapters in that book close to 20 times. A thread of grace stalled in the spring of 1944 when I couldn't see how to get my characters to the summer of that year, right? So she says, when I get completely confused about character arcs and storylines, I cut up a lot of little squares of paper and write each character's moves out and lay the pieces of paper on our big dining room table, trying to figure out how to pace the story by moving the pieces of paper around. Sometimes I try color coding notes, trying to keep the dates straight. And she's asked, does any particular system work? And she says, yeah, all my systems break down pretty quickly, but they're worth the effort. When I abandoned a system of organization, it's because the work of developing it made me focus better and see connections. Timelines work like that. I will do something quite formal for a while, then it stops being necessary as I absorb the dates and places and events. Then she says, when the story is completed, I reread and re-edit dozens of times to make sure I haven't left anything in that should have been cut, or that a minor change early in the book is followed through consistently. Along the way, I'm finding ways to cut unnecessary moments and find poetry in others. Characters deepen, motives get clearer, voices become more distinctive. Editing is the best part of the job for me. The story's all there. All I need to do is make it better. So, in the Meta-Nexus interview, she's asked, what inspired you and helped you create the alien culture of Rakat? And she says, the political model was Romanov Russia, where a tiny elite ruled over a vast serf class until the serfs finally realized, we are many, they are few. Janata culture was somewhat based on the Romanov as well, although that of the pre-revolutionary French aristocracy contributed. For the Runa, the cultural model was a Southeast Asian group called the Samai, who claimed to never get angry, who never argued or competed. When recruited to fight during the Vietnam War, the Samai became stunningly ferocious soldiers. A Samai veteran remarked, we had no rules for stopping a fight. There was nothing between being friends and killing them all. The ecological model of the relationship between the Janata and the Runa was that of cheetahs and Thompson gazelles. Cheetahs only ate Tommies, so if an epidemic swept through gazelle populations, the cheetah could be extinct in a few weeks. It's very elegant, but a very fragile arrangement. And then she's asked, can you talk a bit more about that modeling? I never heard of that before. And she says, I started by asking myself, what would intelligence look like if you pulled the opportunistic, omnivorous primates out of the paleontological mix? That's us, right? Where else would you get very bright animals? One answer was among the social carnivores like wolves, dog packs, lion prides. Those species vocalized to keep track of one another and to mark territory and coordinate hunting. So I made Janata singing in language the evolutionary outcome of that ancient trait. The next question, what if the Janata had domesticated their prey species? We've done it repeatedly. Cattle, horses, sheep, goats, chickens. So the ancient Janata domesticated Runa herds. It was also plausible that they eventually bred not just for docility and meat, but for intelligence. Just as we've bred dogs to perform various services. Push that further and make the Janata obligate carnivores who can't really hunt or eat much of anything except Runa, then step into the history at the point where the Runa have been bred into an intelligence that overlaps that of the Uber species. You got the makings of an ecological and political drama waiting for a trigger event, which happens in the stories. Finally, another theme is the importance of music in this. And Lightspeed asks her, music plays a key role in these two books. Why did you choose to work with that particular art form? And she says, well, music is a thread through the center of everything that I write. Not sure why, except that I react very strongly to the emotion of music. In Contact, Carl Sagan wrote about an alien group that communicated with us by sending a series of prime numbers, and I thought, personally, I wouldn't walk across the street to meet someone who thought prime numbers were enticing, but music, that has such a direct emotional pull across cultures, across time. We're literally moved by music. We sway to it. We dance. We make love. We pump our fists and bang our heads. We weep. I could imagine being pulled across space by music, and that became the premise for The Sparrow. Opera runs through Children of God. There's a strong consideration of Mahler in a later novel, Dreamers of the Day, right? So music is definitely important. And then she goes on a little bit later to say, there are two cultural elements that exist in all human cultures all the way back to the Neanderthal era. Religion and music. Some people are tone deaf and some people are atheists, but music and religion are as diagnostic of our species as opposable thumbs and bipedal locomotion. Science, by contrast, came late to the species and is still a foreign way of thought for most people. Any accurate portrayal of human beings in fiction has to reflect that. I'm a hardcore biological anthropologist schooled in Popperian logical positivism, but for me, religion is very much like music. Nobody would argue that music is the opposite of science. Nobody would expect a scientist to reject music simply because it's not a collection of empirical observations organized into a body of theory that produces testable hypotheses. Nobody would ask if music is scientifically accurate or if music is less true than science. Comparisons like that are simply meaningless. But she says, consider this. When a stroke destroys the ability to speak and understand spoken language, the ability to sing and recite prayers remains intact. So she comes back to storing language and rationality in one side of the brain and music and religion on the other side. And she says, I find majesty in Moses and Beethoven and in Darwin. I see no compelling reason to choose between them. What we now call science fiction is actually one of the oldest forms of storytelling. So, she comes back to the discussion of that, speculating about alien beings, and she says, at the heart of religion, at the heart of science, and right in the middle of science fiction, there is always one question. So here's where we end with this. What does it mean to be human in a large and frightening and beautiful universe? That's an immense question, and there's many kinds of answers. What a wonderful way to frame the mindset that she has that goes into the plot, the character, the themes, and the world building of these two novels on her part. As we saw in looking at what Mary Doria Russell has to say about the key thematics of her own work, one of them is the tragic, unforeseen consequences of decisions that are often made without enough knowledge about what's going to happen, sometimes even with good intentions or seemingly good decisions at the time. And one of the people who particularly bears the brunt of that is Emilio Sandoz, the arguably most central character of the entire work. We could also talk about Sophia and her call to justice, call to arms, in a similar way. But with Sandoz, it's also wrapped up with what he thinks to be a love affair with God, which turns, rather dark, and we could say carnal to the point of gang rape by aliens in a culture that he thought he understood but actually didn't understand. And so the Sparrow, that's the culminating moment, finding out, him being able to face what has been done to him, but also it has, consequences for the ways in which he views God. And I'm going to just read a few passages from close to the end of the very culmination of the novel. So the first thing is that because of the, Janata attacking the Runa and the fighting back and forth, and then the Janata military coming in, and Mark Robichaud and Emilio being taken prisoner, we have their, let's call him ally, patron, who is going to offer them something that could, save them in some ways, right? And they're not really sure what it means. So here's what Sandoz says. I believe Supari originally meant it to be safe for us. He may not have been clear about his own motives. He felt some duty towards us, perhaps. He was fond of Anne, genuinely, I believe, and we'd made him a very wealthy man. He was quite empathetic for a Janata, I think. He could imagine to some extent what it must be like to be alone and unsupported. In any case, he evidently decided to ransom us and brought us to his home and took responsibility for us. He made us part of his household. That was when he took you to see the ivy, the stoccata? John asked. Yes, for once he did not have to explain. So John is going to explain about what happened to Sandoz and Robichaud. Their hands, their fingers were cut and extended into useless sort of ivy-like hanging things, which resulted in great blood loss for both of them, which kills Mark Robichaud and will damage Emilio's hands, making them effectively useless. So John told the others about the operation, the hastakala, about the way the hands were made to look like the trailing branches of ivy, which grows on stronger plants to symbolize and enforce dependence. John realized now why Mark died. What if Mark was developing scurvy, he'd asked Sandoz. Was there something that you ate that Mark didn't? It wasn't scurvy that killed Mark Robichaud. It was starvation and anemia and quite possibly despair. Because Mark will not eat the Runa meat. Sandoz does. And we read, he realized later he'd gone into clinical shock about halfway through the destruction of his left hand. He's slowly healing from all of it, finds out that Mark has actually dying. And then what happens after that? Well, we read, I think that perhaps I was a disappointment to Sapari, Sandoz told them the next day. Anne was a delight to work with, and they'd enjoyed each other a great deal. I was not nearly so amusing. You were grieving and terrified and half dead, Vogt told him flatly, and John nodded in agreement at last with something Johannes Volker had said. Yes, a poor dinner companion, Sandoz had a bright and brittle sound to him this afternoon. I'm not sure Supari really thought through the idea of formally accepting me as a dependent. It might have been a sort of spontaneous gesture of interplanetary goodwill. Maybe he wished he'd let the government have me after all. In any case, he seemed primarily interested in the trade aspects of the situation, and I was not much good to him as an economic advisor. He asked me if I thought there might be other parties coming from Earth. I told him we'd radioed news of our situation and it was possible that others might come. He decided to learn English from me because it is our lingua franca. And he said, Supari was making the best of things. We had many conversations, and going on a little bit further, he's going to say, by the time that Supari was perhaps ready to move on, he says, my position in the household of Supari Vagager was that of a crippled dependent. He was not a flighty person, but he must have tired of me, or perhaps he simply felt I'd fulfilled my role as a language tutor when he became competent in English, and that it was time for me to take up another position, so to speak. And he's being, asked to explain what's going on, and what ends up happening is Supari essentially trades him away to this poet who will, in effect, reorganize. He's another third. He will reorganize Janata society. And he finds out that, he said to himself, I am in God's hands. Whatever happens to me now is God's will. And then suddenly everything made sense to him, and the joy of that moment took his breath away. He'd been brought here step by step to meet this man, Hlavan Catheri, a poet, perhaps even a prophet, who of all of his kind might know the God who Emilio Sandez served. It was a moment of redemption so profound he almost wept, ashamed his faith had been so badly eroded by inchoate fear and isolation. He tried to pull himself together, wishing he'd been stronger, more durable, a better instrument for his God's design, and yet he felt purified somehow, stripped of all other purpose. But what's actually going to be happening is he's going to be used for sexual fulfillment as a concubine by the poet and his friends. And he's being asked to explain this to people. And he says, can you guess what I thought just before I was used the first time? This is rich. This is very funny. You see, I was scared but didn't understand what was going on. I never imagined. Who could have imagined such a thing? I am in God's hands, I thought. I loved God and trusted in his love. Amusing, isn't it? I laid down all my defenses. I had nothing between me and what happened but the love of God. And I was raped. I was naked before God and I was raped. And he says, it went on for I don't know how long, months. It seemed like eternity. He shared me with his friends. I became rather fashionable. A number of exquisite individuals came to use me. It was a form of connoisseurship, I think. Sometimes there was an audience. He says, distressing, isn't it? It gets worse. Extemporaneous poetry was recited. Songs were written describing the experience, and the concerts were broadcast, just like the songs we heard. You must have heard some of the ones about me by now. They were very beautiful. I was required to listen, though I was perhaps inadequately inappreciative of the artistry. So he goes on a little bit later, and we're going to read, a conversation between Reyes and Giuliani and John. And Reyes says, Emilio is not despicable, but God didn't rape him, even if that's how Emilio understands it now. There's an old Jewish story that says in the beginning God was everywhere and everything, a totality, but to make creation, God had to remove himself from some part of the universe so something besides himself could exist. So he breathed in the places where God withdrew, there creation exists. So God just leaves? John asked. Abandons creation? You're on your own? Apes, good luck? No, he watches, he rejoices, he weeps, he observes the moral drama of human life and gives meaning to it by caring passionately and remembering. And so I'm going to stop with those and then move on to Emilio's realizations about what actually happened. So he's thinking back over his engagement with Supari, and he realizes that there was a misunderstanding about celibacy. Supari realized he longs for others of his kind, and he asks, Sandoz, do you pine for a wife? And Sandoz says, Lord, your grateful guest is celibate. Wives are not taken by such as this unworthy one. So you're kinder like Janata then, who permit only the first 2 children to marry and breed? I too am this thing, celibate. You are third born as I am? No, Lord, second, but among such as your guest, any person may mate and have children, even 5th or 6th born. Well, if you're second, why did you not take a wife? This unworthy one chose not to, Lord. It's an unusual choice among my species as among yours. Men such as your guests leave the families of their birth and do not form attachment to any single person nor make any children. Thus we are free to love without exclusion and to serve many. Supari was shocked. You yourself are a servant to many, then? Yes, Lord, this one was when among his own kind. But there are none of your kind to serve here, Supari thought. Confounded, he fell back among the pile of cushions on which he had lingered as the leavings of his meals cooked. Sandoz, what is your purpose? Why did you come here? Lord, to study the gifts of the tongue, to learn the songs of your people. And we read, Han told me this. You came because you heard the songs of our poets and admired them. He stared at Sandoz, not an interpreter bred to trade, but a second-born who chose to make no children and a poet who serves many. No wonder Sandoz had shown no interest in commerce. That was when everything fell into place. It seemed brilliant at the time. Would it please you to serve among the poets whose songs brought you here, Sandoz? Yes, Lord, this would honor your most unworthy guest truly. So that is why Supari turns him over to Hlavan. And we also find that Hlavan understands what's going on differently as he's mating with it, using Sandoz sexually. He called for the foreigner again. It was different the second time, and the third he called together the best of the poets, the most talented, the most perceptive, and using the foreigner to teach what he'd learned, he found the experience was different for each of them. Now he listened with new understanding and was entranced by the variety and splendor of their songs. He was wrong about the possibility of pure experience. He knew that now. The individual was a lens through which the past looked on the moment and changed the future. Even the foreigner was marked, changed by each episode, in a way that Runa concubines, Janata captives, had never been. So he's not able to recognize the horrible rapes that he's inflicting along with his friends on Sandoz. And we're going to read later on. This is much, much later in the thing. So Sinn Féin is suggesting to Sandoz, and Joseba are talking with him as well, and they're trying to see if there could be any sort of purpose behind what happened to him. So Sandoz says, if Hlavan Catheri were somehow responsible for a change in the status of members of his own species, and I can't imagine how he could be, I would be happy for them. I forgive him nothing. But a small change can perturb a system, Joseba remarked. What if something you said or did influenced Catheri or one of the other Janata? That would make what happened. What, Joseba? Forgivable? Tolerable? Okay, all better? It would redeem what happened to you, Sinn Féin suggested quietly. You never know, Sandoz. What if that bloody Austrian admissions committee had accepted young Mr. Hitler for art school? He was pretty decent with landscapes and architecture. Maybe if he'd gotten his wretched art degrees, everything would have been different. A few words, Emilio, said John with urgency, an act of kindness or love or courage. Sandoz says, all right, for the sake of argument, let's assume that unintended consequences can be for good as well as for ill. The trouble with your proposition as applied to my case is that there was never any opportunity for me to give Hlav and Catheri or his associates a stirring sermon on liberty or the value of souls, Janata, Runa, or human. That was part of it. I don't recall being allowed to say a single word, actually. I did scream quite a bit, fairly incoherently, I'm afraid. So he also says, and I fought like a son of a bitch to keep those fuckers off me, but I doubt even the most charitable of observers would have called that a display of courage. An amusing exercise in futility may have come to mind. So you see, I don't think there's a shred of hope that anyone abstracted any edifying lessons about the sanctity of life or the political virtues of freedom during my ministry to the Janata, and I suggest, gentlemen, we drop this subject for the duration of our subject together. And that indeed is sort of an ending to that. So this is a prime illustration of unforeseen consequences, misunderstandings across cultures that drastically damages many people and is going to lead to consequences that ultimately get resolved in the very end of it with the near extinction of the Janata by the Runa, and then eventually coming together in a new society with a reservation system. There are so many other great philosophical themes running through these novels that we could easily spend 4 or 5 hours discussing them, but all good things must come to an end. So I want to conclude by talking just a little bit about music, which drew the Earth people, the humans, to Rakat in the first place. And Isaac, the child of two of the original crew members, who is himself autistic and is going to be part of this colony of humans, Runa, and Janata, in the end, is going to do something really quite interesting. So we're going to find out that he's going to develop music that is based on the DNA of all three species. So this is Emilio talking with him, and he says, we came because of Hlav Catheri's songs. Not those songs. I can remember an entire DNA sequence as music. Do you understand? No, Emilio thought, feeling stupid. You're a savant then. Isaac reached up and began to pull a coil of hair straight. Music is how I think, he said finally. Then this music is one of your compositions? It is glorious, Isaac. I didn't compose it, I discovered it. Adenine, cytosine, guanine, thiamine, 4 bases. I gave the 4 bases 3 notes each, 1 for each species, 12 tones. There was a longer silence, and Emilio realized he was supposed to draw a conclusion. Out of his depth, he guessed, so this music is how you think about DNA? The words came in a rush. It's DNA for humans and for Janata and Runa played together. Isaac stopped gathering himself. A lot of it is dissonant. I remembered the parts that harmonize. Don't you understand? It's God's music. You came here so I would find it. He said this without embarrassment or pride or wonder. It was, in Isaac's view, a simple fact. I thought God was just a story Hanala liked, he said, but this music was waiting for me. The lock of hair stretched and recoiled over and over. It's no good unless you have all 3 sequences. No one else could have found this, only me. Do you understand now? Dazed, Emilio thought, God was in this place and I did not know it. Yes, he said after a time. I think I understand now. Thank you. And then he says, may I share this music with others, Isaac? Sure, that's the point, Isaac yawned and handed Emilio the tablet. Be careful with it. So it gets sent back to Earth, and long before they arrived home, this is in the coda, reaction to the DNA music had rigidified. Believers found it a miraculous confirmation of God's existence and evidence of divine providence. Skeptics declared it a fraud, a clever trick by the Jesuits to distract attention from their earlier failures. Atheists did not dispute the music's authenticity, but they considered it just another fluke that proved nothing like the universe itself. Agnostics admitted the music was magnificent, but suspended judgment, waiting for who knew what. The pattern was established at Sinai and under the Buddha's tree, on Calvary and at Mecca, in sacred caves, at wells of life amid circles of stone. Signs and wonders are always doubted, and perhaps they're meant to be. In the absence of certainty, faith is more than mere opinion. It is hope. Emilio himself had once read of a savant in Lesotho who had memorized every street map, every street in every city in Africa. If such a person made names into notes, would he have found harmony in addresses? Perhaps, given enough material and enough time and nothing better to do. And if that happened, Emilio asked himself on the long voyage home, would the music be any less beautiful? He was a linguist, after all, and it seemed entirely possible to him that religion and literature and art and music were all merely side effects of a brain structure that comes into the world ready to make language out of noise, sense out of chaos. Our capacity for imposing meaning, he thought, is programmed to unfold the way a butterfly's wings unfold when it escapes the chrysalis, ready to fly. We are biologically driven to create meaning. And if that's so, he asked himself, is the miracle diminished? It was then he came very close to prayer. Whatever the truth is, he thought, blessed be the truth. It's not the complete end of the novel and the sequence, but a good enough end for this and a good enough end to bring the story to a close here. It turns out that there was perhaps some sort of divine mission, as Sandoz thought in the first place, just not the one that he had been banking on. And it took a lot of suffering and insight not his own to actually make it so. So a fitting place to end this wonderful sequence of two great novels, so rich in meaning and conflict and ambiguity. So I hope that if you haven't read them, you'll check them out. If you have, you've found this at least somewhat interesting and on point as a bit of an exploration of the two Sparrow novels.